Hi, welcome back to the Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane as we read chapter 18. Notice our little hint or foreshadowing of what's to come in chapter 18. Let's figure out what's the significance or importance of this button box or box of buttons. We'll soon find out. Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah Ruth was sitting up in bed coughing, and the father came home. He picked Edward up by one of his ears and said, "I ain't never." "It's a baby doll," said Bryce. "Don't look like no baby doll to me." Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. This, he was certain, was the man who crushed the heads of china dolls. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth, between coughs. She held out her arms. "He's hers," said Bryce. "He belongs to her." The father dropped Edward on the bed, and Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed him to Sarah Ruth. "It don't matter anyway," said the father. "Don't make no difference, none of it." "It does so matter," said Bryce. "Don't you sass me," said the father. He raised his hand and slapped Bryce across his mouth, and then he turned and left the house. "You ain't got to worry about him," said Bryce to Edward. "He ain't nothing but a bully, and besides, he don't hardly ever come home." Fortunately, the father did not come back for the day. Bryce went out to work, and Sarah Ruth spent the day in bed, holding Edward in her lap and playing with a box filled with buttons. "Pretty," she said to Edward as she lined up the buttons on the bed and arranged them in different patterns. Sometimes, when a coughing fit was particularly bad, she squeezed Edward so tight that he was afraid he would crack in two. Also, in between coughing fits, she took a sucking on one of the other of Edward's ears. Normally, Edward would have found intrusive, clingy behavior of this sort very annoying, but there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to take care of her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. At the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth and a ball of twine for Edward. Sarah Ruth held the biscuit in both hands and took small, tentative bites. "You eat it all up, honey. Let me hold Jangles," said Bryce. "Him and me got a surprise for you." Bryce took Edward off in a corner of the room, and with his pocket knife he cut off lengths of twine and tied them to Edward's arms and feet, and then tied the twine to sticks of wood. "See, all day I've been thinking about it," Bryce said. "What we're going to do is to make you dance." Sarah Ruth loves dancing. Mama used to hold on to her and dance her around the room. "You eating that biscuit?" Bryce called out to Sarah Ruth. "Uh-huh," said Sarah Ruth. "You hold on, honey. We got a surprise for you." Bryce stood up. "Close your eyes," he told her. He took Edward over to the bed and said, "Okay, you can open them now." Sarah Ruth opened her eyes. "Dance, Jangles," said Bryce, and then, moving the strings with the sticks with his one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop and sway, and the whole while at the same time, with his other hand, he held on to the harmonica and played a bright and lively tune. Sarah Ruth laughed. She laughed until she started to cough, and then Bryce laid Edward down and took Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her and rubbed her back. "You want some fresh air?" he asked her. Let's get you out of this nasty old air, huh?" Bryce carried his sister outside. He left Edward lying on the bed and the rabbit staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling. Thought again about having wings. If he had them, he thought, he would fly high above the world. to where the air was clear and sweet, and he would take Sarah Ruth with him. He would carry her in his arms. Surely, so high above the world, she would be able to breathe without coughing. After a minute, Bryce came back and sighed, still carrying Sarah Ruth. She wants you too, he said. Jangles, said Sarah Ruth. She held out her arms. So Bryce held Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth had Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, "You got to look for falling stars. Them are the ones with magic." They were quiet for a long time, all three of them looking up at the sky. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. Edward thought that maybe she had fallen asleep. "There," she said, and she pointed to a star shrieking through the night sky. "Make a wish, honey," Bryce said, his voice high and tight. "That's your star. You make a wish for anything you want." And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished on it too. Chapter 19. Why is Edward, or a.k.a. Jangles, on the floor? The days passed, the sun rose and set again and again. Sometimes the father came home and sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy and he didn't care. His sweater almost completely unraveled and it didn't bother him. He was hugged half to death and it felt good. In the evenings at the hands of Bryce and at the ends of twine, Edward danced and danced. 1 month passed, and then 2, and then 3. Sarah Ruth got worse. In the 5th month, she refused to eat. The 6th month, she began to cough up blood. Her breathing became ragged and uncertain, as if she was trying to remember in between breaths what to do, what breathing was. "Breathe, honey." Bruce stood over her and said, "Breathe," thought Edward from deep inside the well of his arms. "Please, please, breathe." Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and held Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her back and forth and sang to her on a bright sunny morning in September. Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. "Oh, no," said Bryce. "Oh, honey, take a breath, please." Edward had fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms the night before, and she had not asked for him again. So face down on the floor, arms over his head, Edward listened as Bryce wept. He listened as the father came home and shouted at Bryce. He listened as the father wept. Come on, Jangles. So this is the saddest chapter in the entire book, when Sarah Ruth had now died. Chapter 20. "How many dancing rabbits have you seen in your life?" Bryce said to Edward. "I can tell you how many I've seen. 1, you. That's how you and I are going to make some money. I seen it the last time I was in Memphis. Folks put out any kind of show right there on the street corner and people pay 'em for it. I seen it. The walk to town took all night. Bruce walked without stopping, carrying Edward under one arm and talking to him the whole time. Edward tried to listen, but the terrible scarecrow feeling had come back, the feeling he had when he was hanging by his ears in the old lady's garden, the feeling that nothing mattered and that nothing would ever matter again. And not only did Edward feel hollow, he ached. Every part of his china body ached. He ached for Sarah Ruth. He wanted her to hold him. He wanted to dance for her. And he did dance, but it was not for Sarah Ruth. Edward danced for strangers on a dirty street corner in Memphis. Bryce played his harmonica and moved Edward's strings, and Edward bowed and shuffled and swayed, and people stopped to stare and point and laugh. On the ground in front of them was Sarah Ruth's button box. The lid was open to encourage people to drop change inside it. "Mama," said a small child, "look at the bunny. I want to touch him." He reached out his hand for Edward. "No," said the mother. "Dirty." She pulled the child back away from Edward. "Nasty," she said. A man wearing a hat stopped and stared at Edward and Bryce. "It's a sin to dance," he said. And then, after a long pause, he said, "It's a particular sin for rabbits to dance." The man took off his hat and held it over his heart. He stood and watched the boy and the rabbit for a long time. Finally, he put his hat back on his head and walked away. The shadows lengthened. The sun became an orange, dusty ball low in the sky. Bryce started to cry. Edward saw his tears land on the pavement, but the boy did not stop playing his harmonica. He did not make Edward stop dancing. An old woman leaning on a cane stepped up close to them. She stared at Edward with deep, dark eyes. "Pellegrina?" thought the dancing rabbit. She nodded at him. "Look at me," he said to her. His arms and legs jerked. "Look at me. You got your wish. I have learned how to love. And it's a terrible thing. I'm broken. My heart is broken. Help me." The old woman turned and hobbled away. "Come back," thought Edward. "Fix me." Bryce cried harder. He made Edward dance faster. Finally, when the sun was shown and the streets were dark, Bryce stopped playing his harmonica. "I'm done now," he said. He let Edward fall to the pavement. "I ain't gonna cry anymore." Bryce wiped his nose and his eyes with the back of his hand. He picked up the button box and looked inside it. "We got enough money to get something to eat," he said. "Come on, Jangles." And next tune in for Chapter 22 at Neil's Diner.